Hello and welcome to the interview dialogues of the Trumpet of Truth. I'm your host, Li Chen. And with us today is Ms. Rosita Šorytė, former Lithuanian diplomat for 25 years, who is specializing in humanitarian aid and peacekeeping. She also served as the chairperson of the European Union Working Group on Humanitarian Aid. She is very experienced in the area of religion-based refugee claims. She is the current president of the International Observatory of Religious Liberty of Refugees. Today, we would like to invite her to talk about the asylum issue the Church of Almighty God Christians encounter in overseas countries. Ms. Šorytė, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Ms. Šorytė, in early March of this year, as the president of the International Observatory of Religious Liberty of Refugees, you issued an appeal regarding asylum for refugees with the Church of Almighty God at a side event during the 37th session of the UN Human Rights Council. We are deeply appreciative. You stressed that a great deal of evidence shows that the Church of Almighty God Christians are qualified to receive refugee status because they have suffered long-term serious oppression under the Chinese Communist Party. This is a commonly acknowledged fact. However, some democracies don't acknowledge the fact that the Church of Almighty God is persecuted. What's your opinion on this?
I believe that your church is persecuted in China is very clear. Because if you have the Chinese penal code, and in penal code is written that the Sejin Chao, I might be pronouncing horribly, I know, I'm sorry about that, that the certain religions, they are criminalized and they are so against the law in China. So certainly that the members of these churches, they will be persecuted. That is very clear. And there is a list of groups, and the Church of Almighty God is in that list, who is persecuted or not allowed in China. So the fact is very clear. So it's very, very easy, if you don't even need a lot of more information and more details, that is already clear that the Church of Almighty God is persecuted. It is prohibited in China. As well, we know that even in the cities there are big stands inviting to denounce the members of Church of God, of Church of Almighty God. So there are so many details that is very easy to prove. It's not even to prove. It's very easy. The facts are right here. The problem is why it's not known. And one of the reasons is the situation right now. Because you hear what the problems, in particular Europe, is having with the refugees on one hand, and the migrants on the other hand, because with the war in Syria, so there are millions of refugees coming. Also very difficult situation in Iraq, for instance, the other wars. So there are really people coming by millions. And in particular European countries, we are overflowed by the people. Then the government has, like Italy or France or Germany or any other country, they have the people coming by thousands every single day. So what you first do when they come, you verify that the person has the passport. Then you register the person. Then you start the asylum process. So these things are very difficult. My advice perhaps to you, that you should work very hard to really prepare enough of information, enough of reliable information. Because for the moment, you know perfectly well that the things are changing lately, but like a year or 2 years ago, But if somebody would try to get information about the Church of Almighty God, you open the internet and you find the information about McDonald case, which has nothing to do with you, but the person who is reading cannot know. It's this so-called fake news that lately is extremely popular, that the entire space, the entire media space is overflowed by the news that they are totally fake. It's the biggest problem is because for a while and for many years, this fake news was the only news.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you have the information, the balanced information, there is information which is objective and there is a propaganda. Mm-hmm. But all these things, they are accessible. Mm-hmm. Then you can choose. You see everything. Mm-hmm. The Professor Falk wrote about you. Professor Introvini wrote about you. Who else? So it's these good objective articles where you can really find the real information about you. They just appeared, because like a year ago, it was none. It was only the bad news. So and that's what I said in the beginning of our interview, that is more is needed, because as you have the good news about you, the objective assessments and not the propaganda, then the propaganda is just, it's just there, but it's not that important. Because it's like when you have the reputable professors, scholars making the objective analysis, and you have the Chinese information, it's for anybody who is really intelligent enough and who is critical enough knows that in China, human rights problems, they are big. So, and the information that for instance, country like China is providing, it might be, you should question. You cannot believe right away. But you should have something that is reputable, something that is objective and reliable. And these things, they are very new. So this process is very, very new. Because if you would say to me that 5 years ago and 10 years ago, it was this objective information available, and the judges and countries, they don't take into account them, and they just listen what the Chinese say, I would say it's very wrong. But the problem is that this objective information just starts to come. So I would say that the patience is needed.
The Church of Almighty God is the most persecuted house church by the CCP. This is common knowledge in mainland China. There are banners with slogans in the streets against the Church of Almighty God. The national propaganda machine creates public broadcast against the church. Newspapers openly publish articles condemning and blaspheming against the church. And armed police officers and public security officers openly arrest Christians from the Church of Almighty God. In mainland China, this is known by practically everyone. It is common knowledge. In particular, the CCP shifted the blame for the May 28th Zhaoyuan McDonald's murder onto the Church of Almighty God, and used that to suppress the church. They also openly spread it to the rest of the world. Why is it that so many countries in Asia and Europe won't acknowledge the fact of the oppression of the Church of Almighty God? Especially the Christians who have applied for political asylum in countries such as South Korea, France, and Italy. These countries' government have not referred to the independent research literatures on the Church of Almighty God conducted by the expert and academics, but just deny the truth of their oppression based on fake news manufactured by the Chinese government that have been debunked by the expert and academics. They don't grant these Christians asylum, particularly in France, over 100 Christians have already received departure orders, and they are facing the danger of being deported back to China and suffering more serious persecution. These countries generally reject their applications for asylum by claiming that there's no sufficient evidence that these Christians are individually persecuted. What do you think of this?
You don't need to, because the United Nations High Representative for Refugees, in 2004 they issued the guidelines, and in the guidelines it's very clearly indicated that you don't need to prove the individual persecution. If the group is persecuted, you are persecuted. And also it's very logic. It's like person who is in prison for 10 years, he cannot flee the foreign country. So, but what about if you are denounced? For instance, some of your brothers and sisters received from some friends, they don't flee, tomorrow they will be persecuted. And by the way, if you cannot confess your religion freely, and there are some punishments, that is a persecution. Because the torture is another level. When you are physically abused. So what we are talking when person is arrested is not already, it's a little bit higher than just the persecution. Persecution when you are not allowed, your books are taken away, you are not allowed to have the masses, that is a persecution. But arrest is already, it goes a little bit higher than just the simple persecution. So, and you don't need to prove to. The only thing that you need to prove is that you are the member of the specific church. So it's, see, this why is difficult to get the refugee status? Because there is a lot of problems. And for the countries, there are a lot of challenges. So they need really to be sure. But on the other hand, sometimes states, they are not doing their work as well. But the good news, because your case is clearly, you are clearly entitled for the refugee status. You're clearly entitled. There are all the details, because really, we made a lot of analysis. I interviewed many members of your church. So it's clearly that you are the classical case for refugee status. To tell you the truth, nobody, like the democratic countries, nobody believes that the human rights situation in China is okay. Mm-hmm. That is a fact.
Yeah.
So, if somebody would say that China is the country where the human rights are respected and every people feel free and in prosperity, that would be very difficult. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that China is a big economic power right now. So, and when you have the contracts for the states, it's like you have a contract or you criticize China. You have the good relations, economic relationships, and money comes from this business, mm-hmm. or you criticize. And finally, mm-hmm. very often, the economical side is taking over. And the countries, and all the countries, but in particular Korea, so naturally they have very close economic relations. Mm-hmm. They have the political issues to deal. Mm-hmm. Like the North Korean factor, and China is really very important, mm-hmm. important intermediator. So there are a lot of challenges for Korea. Mm-hmm. So that is understandable. Mm-hmm. And all the countries, they prefer to have the good relationships with China. Mm-hmm. And China would try to force them, but there are limits, how long and how much you can do that. Because if the facts are really proven, nobody really can deny, but it's a long work.
Ms. Šorytė, you as well as some well-known religious experts and academics have issued appeals and gone all over the places for the sake of the Church of Almighty God Christians being granted asylum. We'd like to express our admiration for such acts of justice. Experts and academics, such as yourself, are all people who have been lifted up by God in the last days. You have your own missions within God's management, and you emit light in a dark and evil world. What you are doing is incredibly meaningful, and it is the most gratifying and joyful thing that a person can do in their life. You will certainly be blessed by God.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
We look forward to the day that the countries where the Church of Almighty God Christians are displaced are able to fully understand our faith and can accept the correct information and news on our church. Ideally, they will personally come to our churches to see for themselves, read Almighty God's words in the last days, as well as various films, hymns, and videos disseminated by the church. All of these things bring mankind a great positive impact and contribution. One cannot only listen to the one-sided lies from the CCP. Hearing one side of the story keeps you in the dark, but hearing both sides brings you into the light. This is the only way to understand the true fact of the persecution of the Church of Almighty God, and asylum should be granted to these Christians. This is what we are hoping for. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.